Zethra's breath came in shallow, uneven bursts, the cool metal of the human ship's holding cell pressing against her back. Her mind swam with visions of what was to come. She had seen the aftermath of human attacks before, their reputation preceded them throughout the galaxy. Ruthless, efficient, merciless. Zethra had always been taught that the humans were unmatched predators, especially in war. The cold steel around her seemed to confirm that expectation. The door slid open with a hiss, and a human soldier stepped inside. Zethra tensed, her antennae stiffening in fear. Her eyes darted to the man standing at the doorway. He was tall, with stern features that seemed carved from stone. His blue uniform was crisp, but it did nothing to disguise the aura of lethal precision surrounding him. His name, she knew, was Captain Alex Weaver, leader of the human unit that had captured her. She held her breath, expecting him to deliver the terms of her execution, or perhaps a list of tortures they would inflict first. That's how these things always went. The weak were broken before they were discarded. And in her current state, weakened and disoriented from the skirmish that led to her capture, she was certainly the weak one. "We'll bring food in a moment," Weaver said calmly. His voice was surprisingly soft, almost casual, but she caught a glimpse of something unreadable in his eyes. "We won't harm you." "There's no need for that." "No harm?" It had to be a trick. She had been trained to expect such tactics from humans. Psychological warfare, break their minds before their bodies. Zethra steeled herself, trying not to let her disbelief show. Still, her silence must have betrayed her fear, for Weaver's gaze softened, and he gave her a brief nod before turning on his heel and leaving the room. Zethra's mind reeled. It had to be a tactic, some cruel game. She closed her eyes and tried to center herself, recalling the words of her instructors. Humans are predators, never forget that. They take what they want and destroy those who resist. Yet, this calm demeanor wasn't what she had prepared for. The cell wasn't a torture chamber, the humans hadn't beaten her or even interrogated her yet. As she waited, tension mounted, but nothing happened. Time passed. The silence in the cell began to gnaw at her thoughts, feeding her anxiety. The human captain had seemed so unconcerned. Where was the rage? The hatred? The vindictive retribution she'd expected for being a Zorthal? She could still hear her commander's voice ringing in her ears. "If you are captured, you will not survive. Do not expect mercy." She didn't. She couldn't. The door opened again, and this time it was another soldier, smaller, younger, who set a tray of food on the floor and quickly left without a word. Zethra eyed the tray suspiciously. Surely this was some new kind of trick. Poison, perhaps? But no, it would be too obvious, too crude. These humans were known for more sophisticated means of torment. She let the food sit untouched for a long time, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the inevitable pain. But nothing came. Her stomach growled in betrayal. Starvation wasn't part of her plan either, and the ache in her belly eventually overpowered her caution. Carefully, she lifted the tray, sniffing the contents. It was plain, nothing she recognized, but it didn't smell of poison. She took a small bite, then another. The food was simple but warm. Nourishing. She ate in silence, her mind racing. Why feed a prisoner so well? What were they planning? Hours passed. Zethra lay in the cold room, her thoughts tangled in confusion. This was not how she expected her capture to go. There was supposed to be violence, interrogation, yet all she had encountered was indifference. Kindness, even. As the minutes dragged on, the door opened again. This time, Weaver stepped back inside, his eyes meeting hers. Zethra froze, her limbs tense with the fear of what might come next. "How are you feeling?" he asked, taking a seat in the corner of the small room. His posture was relaxed, as if he wasn't sitting across from an enemy officer. Zethra glared at him, her antennae twitching involuntarily. Why was he asking her such a question? Did he expect her to thank him for not killing her yet? She remained silent, her mind racing for a strategy. If she was to survive, she needed to understand their game, anticipate their moves. "You're safe here," he continued, as if sensing her hesitation. "I know what you're thinking, but we're not here to hurt you." A laugh almost escaped her, but she caught it before it could surface. Did he really think she would believe that? After all her people had seen and suffered? Zethra's entire being screamed at her not to trust him. But at the same time, she couldn't understand why he would lie about something so simple. What did he gain by treating her this way? Where was the anger, the brutality? Weaver's eyes flicked to her wrist, where a small wound from the battle still festered. "You should let our medic look at that," he said quietly. "We can't have an infection setting in." Zethra blinked. Why did he care about her injury? She was an enemy, wasn't she? Slowly, she nodded, unsure of why she agreed. Weaver stood, his expression remaining neutral as he headed toward the door. "Someone will be by shortly to treat that. If you need anything else, just let me know," he said, his voice once again carrying that strange calmness. With that, he left her alone once more. Zethra sat there in stunned silence, staring at the closed door. She expected punishment, fear, and pain. She got something else entirely. Zethra waited for the inevitable cruelty to reveal itself. Her mind wouldn't let her believe that what she was experiencing was genuine. But as the days passed, no torture came, no harsh words, no demands for information. Instead, the humans continued to treat her with a strange, disarming level of decency. It was unsettling. Every interaction, every small gesture made her question everything she thought she knew about humans. Weaver returned, this time with a small meal, as if this was becoming routine. He sat across from her again, his movements calm and measured. Zethra's eyes narrowed as he handed her the tray. She wasn't hungry, not really. Not for food. She was starving for answers. What was his angle? Why were they doing this? He asked her simple questions. How was she feeling? Did she need anything? Zethra's answers were clipped, guarded, but Weaver didn't seem to mind. He was patient. Too patient. Every minute of this civility only deepened her suspicion. Zethra had been taught that humans didn't show kindness. This had to be a new tactic, a way to break her defenses before they truly struck. As he spoke, Zethra found herself watching him closely. His face was unreadable, but his words, there was no malice in them. He spoke of home, of his crew, of missions he'd been on, as if they were old friends sharing stories instead of sworn enemies. It didn't make sense. None of it did. Eventually, her curiosity got the better of her, and she asked him outright, "Why haven't you tortured me for information?" She regretted the bluntness of her words immediately, but Weaver didn't seem taken aback. Instead, he looked at her with a kind of mild amusement, as if the question itself was ridiculous. "We don't operate like that," he said simply. "Torture doesn't get you the truth. It only breeds resentment. We want peace, not endless cycles of violence." Zethra stared at him, her antennae twitching with confusion. Peace? The word was almost foreign to her. She had lived her whole life preparing for war, for the inevitable conflicts that defined the galaxy. Peace was something fragile, fleeting, and humans, Deathworlders, weren't supposed to be interested in such things. Yet, here he was, speaking of it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Weaver leaned back slightly, as if sensing her skepticism. "I get it," he continued, his tone softer now. "You've probably heard a lot about us. We're not oblivious to how we're seen out there. Ruthless. Dangerous. And yeah, when we have to fight, we fight to win. But we don't revel in it. We don't enjoy cruelty. We protect our own, that's all." Zethra couldn't help but feel a flicker of doubt in her resolve. Could he be telling the truth? Was it possible that the humans weren't the monsters they had been made out to be? The more Weaver spoke, the harder it became to reconcile the man in front of her with the image of humanity she had carried for so long. Still, her instincts wouldn't allow her to fully believe him. It had to be some elaborate ruse. The humans were just waiting for her to let her guard down before they struck. But when would they? Why were they taking so long? As days passed, Zethra couldn't help but notice the small acts of kindness, the way the humans adjusted the temperature in her cell after she shivered during the cold nights, the way Weaver ensured she was always fed, even when she couldn't bring herself to eat much. It wasn't the treatment she expected from captors, especially not human ones. Weaver's words stuck with her, gnawing at the edges of her certainty. She had expected violence, hatred, perhaps even the cold satisfaction of a conqueror, but she had found something else entirely, something that left her more unsettled than any torture could have. The air between them hung heavy with silence as Zethra processed Weaver's words. They lingered in her mind like an itch she couldn't scratch. His kindness wasn't normal. It couldn't be. Yet, each day, it became harder to deny that what he said, what he did, wasn't part of some elaborate scheme. There was no ulterior motive. No interrogation waiting around the corner. Only more conversations, more stories. Weaver continued to visit, and though Zethra tried to keep her guard up, she found herself speaking more. She couldn't help it. He didn't press her for classified information or demand anything of her, but there was something disarming about the way he talked, about humanity's struggles, their battles not just for survival, but for peace. Zethra had been taught that humans fought because they enjoyed destruction, but the way Weaver described it, humans fought only when they had no other choice. One evening, she shared a little of her own story. The words came out before she could stop them, almost by accident. She told him about her upbringing, the strict military life she'd been thrust into, how her people had always viewed war as a necessary path to progress. Her commanders had drilled it into them, there was no room for weakness. No place for hesitation. Conquer or be conquered. That was the Zorthal way. Weaver listened intently, never interrupting. When she finished, he didn't judge, didn't lecture. Instead, he shared more about Earth. About the wars humans had fought not because they wanted to, but because they had been left no choice. Wars to protect their home, their loved ones. Battles waged with the same resolve she had been trained to have, but for reasons far different from what she had been led to believe. For the first time, Zethra found herself wondering, was it possible that she had been wrong about humans all along? Could it be that they weren't the heartless killers her people made them out to be? She had seen their destructive power on the battlefield, but now she was beginning to see something else, something more complicated. One night, the ship was hit by a sudden surge of turbulence. The lights flickered, alarms blared, and Zethra's heart pounded as she braced herself against the cold wall of her cell. Moments later, the door burst open, and Weaver rushed in, grabbing her arm with firm, but not painful, urgency. "Come with me," he said. Zethra hesitated, but there was no time for questions. She followed him, her mind racing with fear and confusion. What was happening? The ship shook violently again, throwing them both off balance. Weaver quickly steadied her, his expression grim but controlled. As they navigated through the chaos, a part of Zethra expected this to be some kind of trap. Maybe the humans were using the situation to lure her into a false sense of security before showing their true colors. But then, something she didn't expect happened. A piece of debris broke loose from the ceiling ahead of them, heading straight for her. Instinctively, Zethra flinched, but Weaver moved faster. Without hesitation, he shoved her out of the way, taking the brunt of the blow on his arm. He winced in pain but kept moving, guiding her to safety. Zethra was stunned. He had protected her. Risked his life for hers. Why? As they reached a safer area, Weaver let out a breath, his arm clearly injured, but he waved off her concern. "We'll be fine," he muttered, brushing it off like it was nothing. But to Zethra, it wasn't nothing. She had seen humans fight, seen their deadly efficiency in combat. They didn't need her. They could have let her die, and it would have made no difference to them. Yet Weaver had saved her. Why? Back in the relative safety of her cell, Zethra couldn't shake the questions swirling in her mind. Humans weren't supposed to act like this. No one had prepared her for this kind of behavior. Was it possible that humans were more than just the ruthless warriors she had always believed them to be? Each time she tried to dismiss the idea, her mind returned to the moment Weaver had thrown himself in harm's way for her. There had been no calculation in his actions, no cold strategy. He had simply acted, instinctively, as if her life mattered. Zethra stared at the ceiling, her thoughts refusing to settle. Weaver's actions had forced her to confront something she had never considered before. Maybe humans weren't monsters. Maybe they weren't the heartless predators her people had painted them to be. Maybe they were something else entirely. Zethra found herself torn. The more time passed, the harder it became to cling to the image of humans she had held for so long. Weaver's actions had shattered her expectations. She had anticipated cruelty, manipulation, even betrayal. But instead, he had shown her something she had never experienced before, genuine concern. She was a prisoner, an enemy, and yet, Weaver had treated her like an equal, not a target. It didn't make sense. Zethra's mind raced as she replayed their conversations, trying to find a hidden motive. But there was none. The humans had never interrogated her, never sought to extract information. She had given them nothing of value, and still, they had treated her with care. Her wound had been healed, her basic needs met, and she had been shown a level of respect that baffled her. She thought back to the moment Weaver had saved her life. He could have let her die. The thought circled in her mind relentlessly. It would have been easy for him to let the debris crush her, and no one would have blamed him. Yet, he hadn't hesitated to protect her. Zethra had been taught that life was a constant struggle for dominance, and in the grander scheme of things, her life should have been expendable to a human. But it wasn't. To him, it wasn't. This revelation unsettled her more than any battle ever had. Everything she had believed about humans had been called into question. If Weaver's actions were any indication, then perhaps the humans weren't the monsters she had been raised to fear. Maybe they were just like her, fighting to survive in a chaotic galaxy, protecting those they cared about. But there was something deeper, something Zethra hadn't been prepared for: empathy. Weaver returned again, his arm still bandaged from the injury he had sustained while protecting her. He didn't seem to think much of it, brushing off her concerned gaze with his usual casual demeanor. But Zethra couldn't let it go. "Why?" she asked him, her voice quiet but steady. "Why did you save me?" He looked at her, the question hanging in the air between them. For a moment, she saw the gears turning behind his eyes, as if he were trying to find the simplest way to explain something far more complex. "You're a person, just like me," he said finally. "It wasn't a choice. It was the right thing to do. The right thing to do." Those words echoed in her mind. Zethra had always seen herself as a soldier first, her individual life inconsequential in the larger conflict. But Weaver had made her see herself differently, made her realize that to the humans, every life mattered. Even the life of an enemy. Zethra was silent for a long moment, trying to process this. It went against everything she had been taught. Her entire life had been built on the idea that survival came at the expense of others, that peace was a fleeting dream overshadowed by inevitable conflict. Yet here she was, being shown a different path. Weaver's words cut deeper than any weapon. It wasn't just his actions that had changed her perspective, it was the simplicity of his belief. Humans weren't driven by conquest or domination. They were driven by something far more powerful: compassion. Even for their enemies. Zethra had never considered the possibility that humans could be capable of such a thing. In her world, strength was measured in victories, and weakness was eradicated. But humans, these Deathworlders, seemed to measure their strength in something entirely different. Something that didn't come from destruction, but from protecting and preserving life. Her antennae twitched as she glanced at him, the weight of her unspoken thoughts growing heavier by the second. There was no manipulation in his words, no ulterior motive. Just honesty. Zethra realized then that she had been wrong about humans, terribly wrong. For the first time since her capture, Zethra allowed herself to relax, even if only a little. She had expected to die at the hands of these humans, but instead, she had been given something far more valuable: understanding. Weaver had shown her that humanity wasn't defined by their reputation as warriors. They were complex, flawed, but ultimately, they were guided by a moral compass that sought to avoid needless suffering. Zethra had spent her entire life training for war, raised on the belief that enemies were meant to be conquered, not understood. Yet here she was, sitting across from a human who had turned everything she believed upside down. She had expected to find ruthlessness, cruelty, maybe even a form of violence wrapped in civility. Instead, she had found compassion, patience, and, more unsettling than anything else, empathy. Her own people had never spoken of peace the way humans did. For them, war was a cycle, necessary, inevitable. But humans didn't seem to see it that way. They fought, yes, and they fought fiercely when provoked. But they fought to end wars, not perpetuate them. Zethra had seen that now, with her own eyes. What Weaver had shown her wasn't just a facade, it was genuine. His concern for her, his willingness to protect her even though she was an enemy, it wasn't a trick. It was real. Weaver didn't come to her cell that day, but Zethra found herself thinking about him constantly. His words played over in her mind. She had been prepared for the worst when captured, ready to endure whatever cruelties humans had in store for her. But now, she was no longer sure what to expect. Not from Weaver, not from any of them. When he finally returned, Zethra spoke first. "We were taught that humans are dangerous, that you only care about power. But you've shown me something different. Why do you fight if not for domination?" Weaver looked at her for a moment, his eyes studying her face. "We fight to protect what we care about," he said slowly. "We're not interested in ruling the galaxy. We've seen enough destruction. We fight because we have to, not because we want to." Zethra nodded, absorbing his words. It made sense now, their tenacity in battle, their unwillingness to surrender. They weren't driven by a hunger for conquest but by a fierce instinct to defend. To protect what mattered to them. It was so different from the way her people thought. The Zorthal fought for superiority, for expansion. But the humans, they fought for survival, for peace. "I didn't expect this from you," she admitted softly, her antennae drooping slightly in an unfamiliar display of vulnerability. I thought you would kill me." Weaver's face softened. "We don't kill without reason. And there was no reason. You're not a threat anymore. You're just someone trying to survive, like us." The simplicity of his statement struck her. She had never thought of it that way. In the galaxy, species were pitted against each other, each one vying for dominance. But Weaver wasn't interested in that. To him, she was just another person, not an enemy to be crushed. The realization settled over her like a weight, and for the first time, Zethra felt a crack in the walls she had built around her heart. She had been wrong. Humans weren't the monsters her people made them out to be. They were complex, capable of great destruction but also great kindness. Weaver had saved her, not because he had something to gain, but because he saw value in her life, even as an enemy. And that, more than anything else, had shaken her to her core. "I don't know what to do with this," Zethra admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. "I was ready to die. I was ready for torture, for pain. But this is harder." Weaver leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "I get that. It's not easy, questioning everything you've been taught. But maybe this is a chance to see things differently. You don't have to fight us. You don't have to see us as enemies." Zethra's eyes met his, searching for any hint of deception, but there was none. He meant it. He was offering her a choice, something she had never been given before. The Zorthal had always told her what to believe, what to fight for. But here, now, Weaver was giving her the freedom to decide for herself. It terrified her. But it also filled her with a strange sense of hope. Maybe things didn't have to be the way they always had been. Maybe humans weren't the death-bringers her people feared. Maybe they were something else entirely, something she could no longer ignore. "I'll think about it," she said finally, unsure of what else to say. Weaver smiled, a small, understanding smile that didn't push her for more. "That's all I can ask." With that, he stood, giving her a nod before leaving the cell. Zethra sat in silence, her mind racing. She had expected so much from these humans: violence, cruelty, dominance. But what they had given her instead was far more difficult to handle: compassion, understanding, and a chance to reconsider everything she knew. As she lay back on the small cot in her cell, Zethra felt the weight of her own beliefs pressing down on her. She wasn't sure where this new understanding would lead, but one thing was certain: the humans had changed her.